Yeah, no choice. No choice.
Okay. So just when you thought there were no tests on the material, I do have a test on what we covered last week. So let's see how much people learned last week. First one is fill in the blank. Augustus said, it's better to be Herod's blank.
Hey.
than his son." All right, that one stuck. That's good. Who of the following did Herod not execute?
Sister.
Choose one. His mother-in-law Alexandra, his wife Mariamne, his sister Salome, or 3 of his sons.
Sister.
His sister.
Well, you guys are good. You're really paying attention.
Did he have more than 3 sons?
Oh, yes, and we're gonna meet 3 more of them tonight. So yes, he had 5 wives. So lots of children. All right, and then name one symptom of Herod's evil. Remember the disease that Herod died of.
Dysentery or diarrhea?
The dysentery and diarrhea was one of them. So, all right, why aren't you going down? There we go. Okay, so we got that one. It's better to be Herod's pig than his son. That was Augustus's remark after finding out that Herod had executed not 1, not 2, but 3 of his sons for so-called treason. You got it right. That the one family member that he did not execute was his sister Salome, and we're gonna see a little more of Salome tonight as well.
Is she the same Salome with the John the Baptist?
No, that's a different Salome. And then name one symptom of Herod's evil, the disease. So one of them was putrescent stomach. I didn't hear anybody say that one.
No.
Corpse-like breath.
I think you mentioned.
Didn't hear that one. Maggots breeding in the privy members, probably my favorite. And then the constant watery flow from the bowels causing inflamed madness. So not a pleasant condition to receive. All right, let's review what we covered in the first couple weeks and what we need to remember for tonight's episode. So the Greeks ruled Judea for about 150 years-ish, from 330 BC to 164 BC, and that's when the Hasmoneans or the Maccabees revolt, and they rule Judea for about a century, right? And what we saw that the Maccabees, Hasmoneans, was that they conquered the surrounding territories around Judea, and then they forcibly converted the population of those areas to Judaism. And a couple of those areas included Idumea, which is important to us because that's where the Herodians come from, and Galilee, of course, that's where Jesus is going to be born. So it's a civil war between 2 of the Hasmonean brothers that in a way leads to the Roman takeover of Judea, and the Hasmoneans then rule as Roman clients, which is the same way that King Herod will rule, right? He's what we call a Roman client king, meaning he rules his kingdom, but he both pays tribute to Rome and he doesn't have the autonomy to govern his own foreign policy. Rome sets his foreign policy for him.
But he's pretty free to do the.
Inside the boundaries of his kingdom, pretty much has a free hand. Exactly. Yep. So we saw that the most important marriage that Herod had was to this daughter of the Hasmoneans, Mariamne, right? Because he was an Idumean, right? And in the eyes of the Jews, of his subjects, he was not a full Jew. And so by marrying this woman from the Hasmonean family, that kind of gave him the good housekeeping seal of approval, right? It made him seem more part of the true Jews. Although, as we're going to see, Herod never really fully gets acceptance among the Jews. So as we saw, he really had a bloody reign, right? He executed a lot of people, a lot of family members, and pretty much anybody that he viewed as a threat to his power. But in a lot of ways, it was a successful reign, right? And in particular, he's very deft in managing his Roman overlords, if you will. So he was able to even increase his power, even though he had supported the wrong horse in the Roman Civil War between Antony and Octavian. Octavian is what Augustus was called before the Senate gave him that title. So same guy. We saw that during his reign, he basically maintains peace in Palestine, but he embraced the Greco-Roman culture. So he really modernized Judea, which in some people's eyes was a good thing. It was a progressive thing, but in the eyes of the conservative Jews, who were a large segment of his subjects, right, that was not a good thing. He was taking the country in the wrong direction. We saw that he had a very grand building program. One of the things that he did was he rebuilt the second temple, the temple that Cyrus the Great, the Persian, had built for the Jews, right? And apparently this was quite a spectacular edifice. There was an ancient proverb that said, "He who has not seen Herod's temple has not seen anything beautiful." So reputed throughout the ancient world as this great thing. All right, so where are we in our course outline? We covered the Maccabean revolt and that brief period of Jewish independence during the first session. Last week, we devoted it entirely to Herod the Great. Tonight, we're going to look at Judea when it becomes a Roman prefecture, direct rule by the Romans rather than by a Herodian. And of course, next week we'll finish up with the Jewish revolt. So any questions about what we covered in the first two sessions before we get into tonight's content? Okay, so Herod dies of that horrible disease that we talked about, and he divides his kingdom among three of his sons and gives part of it to his sister Salome. Okay, so the biggest portion goes to a guy named Archelaus. It's actually Herod Archelaus, but I'm just going to call him Archelaus because we already have too many Herods, as you're going to find out. It's going to get very confusing. So Archelaus gets the biggest chunk. He gets Judah and Samaria. Okay. Another son, Herod Antipas, is given Galilee. Now, Herod Antipas, that's the Herod in the Gospels at Jesus's trial. Okay, so we got Herod the Great is the one who killed the babies when Jesus was born. Herod Antipas, his son, is the Herod at the time of the trial. A third son, Philip, it's this kind of northeastern part of Herod the Great's domains. And then Salome gets a couple little chunks kind of scattered here and there. She rules as a queen, basically a handful of cities.
Mike, was that area Philip had, was that the Decapolis or part of the Decapolis?
Yes, the Decapolis is up there in that area. Decapolis being 10 cities. And I wish I had a map that showed that better, but more or less, yes. So who is Archelaus, the guy that gets the biggest share of Herod's kingdom? Remember, he had killed three of his sons on trumped up or actual charges of treason, but fortunately for him, he had an abundance of sons that he could fall back on. Well, Archelaus was studying in Rome when Herod, on his deathbed, realizes he's got to name a new heir. So he sends word to Archelaus, who is studying in Rome. Remember, some of Herod's other sons had gone there. This was very important for Herod to cultivate relationships with the Romans, okay? So Archelaus was there studying and gets word that his father is dying and he needs to go back to Judea and rule as his father's heir. So the first thing that happens after Herod dies is that there is an uprising among the Jews, and they want vengeance on some of Herod's advisors whom they viewed as particularly odious. They want to take their pound of flesh. So the first thing that Archelaus has to do in his capacity as king is to put down this uprising, and he does it very violently. So he gets off on the wrong foot with the Jews right from the get-go. So as a result of that, the Jews send a delegation to Rome saying, we don't want another Herodian as our king. We would rather have a foreigner, a Roman, come and rule us than be subject to another Herodian. So Archelaus is forced early on to go back to Rome again and basically defend himself and explain why he should keep the power that Rome has given him. And he sweet talks Augustus enough that Augustus actually kind of promotes him and names him ethnarch and names his two brothers, Herod Antipas and Philip, as tetrarchs, rulers of a fourth part. Okay, so Archelaus is kind of the senior partner in this arrangement. So he goes back to Judea, with Augustus's reinforced backing, and one of his first acts is that he marries his widowed sister-in-law, one of the women that was married to one of these brothers that got executed. And among the devout Jews, this angers them. They say that he's committing incest by marrying his sister-in-law. So again, getting on the wrong foot with his subjects. Then his greedy side starts to come forward, and in his 10-year reign, he deposes 3 high priests in favor of somebody promising him a bigger bribe for the office. Okay, so he's really annoying the Jews, causing them to send yet another deputation to go to Rome, pleading with the Romans, please get rid of this guy. We'd even rather have a Roman over us than Archelaus. So Augustus hears their pleas, calls Archelaus in again, and this time he deposes Archelaus and exiles him to Gaul, basically France. Okay, so as far away in the Roman Empire as you can get from Judea, practically. So now what Augustus does is he converts what used to be Archelaus's territory into a Roman prefecture. He makes it part of the Roman province of Syria, and it's going to have a Roman official as its governor. So this is where we get the office that Pontius Pilate is going to occupy. So we still have Herod Antipas ruling up in Galilee, and we still have Philip ruling his share, okay? But what used to be Archelaus as part of the tetrarchy, okay, is now what is called a Roman prefecture. And what a prefecture is to the Romans, it's basically an appendage or a little add-on to a larger province. So in this case, the larger province in question is Syria to the north, and Judea is just this little thing that's added on as an extra piece, okay? That's called a prefecture. And at the same time that Augustus is kind of reorganizing this and expanding the province called Syria, he names a new governor of Syria, a guy named Quirinius, which that name should be familiar to us, right? We heard it just a month ago during the Christmas stories, okay? Quirinius was the governor of Syria who ordered the census to be taken in Judea. And the reason he did this was, for the first time, this little piece of land, Judea, is now under direct Roman rule. And I need to figure out how much do I need to tax these people. So Quirinius, in the year 6 AD, orders a census in Judea. And we know this is the case because it's attested not just in the Gospel of Luke, but also by the Jewish historian Josephus. Okay. And of course, in Luke, it says, now it came about in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabitants of the earth. So Luke was a little confused here. It was really just a census of Judea. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So again, that happens in 6 AD, and Luke connects that to the birth of Jesus, right? That's why Joseph and Mary have to leave Galilee. They have to leave Nazareth in Galilee and go to Bethlehem, right? Because that's where Joseph's family is from, according to Luke. But somebody had asked the question a couple of weeks ago, if Herod died in 4 BC, 4 years before Christ, how could Jesus be born 4 years before Jesus, right? And the answer is, the guy who put together that numbering was confused, okay? But even more confused, I think, is Luke, because the census of Quirinius happens in 6 AD, 10 years after the death of King Herod. So how could Jesus both be born in the reign of King Herod and during the census of Quirinius? Well, there are a couple other problems with Luke's account that suggest probably Jesus was born, more toward the early end of that than actually under Quirinius's census. Number one, Joseph was from Nazareth in Galilee, right? And we've just seen that Galilee was not part of this new Roman prefecture of Judea, right? So he wouldn't have been subject to the census anyway, okay? Luke tells us that Joseph and his family had to travel to Bethlehem because that's where his family was from, but no other source tells us that the Romans made people travel to the place where they were from. Their family was from in order to be counted by a census. And really, if you think about it, that would be hugely disruptive to, the economy, making people travel all over the place for a census. And it doesn't strike us as something the Romans, who were very logical in government matters, would do. And Luke also places the census concurrent in the reign of Herod the Great. So Luke seems a little confused on his chronology at this time period.
Confused or trying to tell a story?
They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, are they? For those of you in Zoom land, if you didn't hear Sam, he said, was Luke confused or was he trying to tell a story? So one thing that happens as a result of this census, this Roman counting of the heads in Judea, is there's actually a revolt among the Jews led by a guy named Judas the Galilean. Judas doesn't like the idea of foreigners coming in and ruling Judea, even though, interestingly, we saw it was the Jews themselves in Judea who asked for it, right? But there's all kinds of opinions in Judea at this time, and Judas is on the other end. He doesn't like the idea of the Romans coming in and ruling, so he urges non-compliance with the census. And in fact, he and his followers punish those people who comply with the census as if they are kind of aiding and abetting. Okay? So he steals their cattle or burns their houses. Now, this revolt is short-lived. Judas himself is killed during the revolt, but his followers remain in place as a movement called the Zealots. And the Zealots are basically they exist for the purpose of getting rid of the Romans as their rulers. And as we're going to see, they're the ones who are going to incite the Jewish revolt. So Quirinius is the governor of Syria, and now he's got to figure out, how am I going to administer this new thing that Augustus has added on, this prefecture called Judea. So he entrusts the rule of that little part of his province to a junior official called a prefect. And this guy's name is Coponius. So the prefects, right, are lower in rank than the provincial governors. So whereas Quirinius could be a member of the Senate back in Rome, he's a member of the highest level of Roman society. This junior official is taken from one notch lower on the Roman ranks, the equestrian rank, or some people call it the knightly rank. So still high up, but not at the highest level in Roman society. So in other words, the guys ruling Judea are not considered the cream of the crop in Rome, okay? They're not the most prestigious people. That's kind of a second-class posting, if you will, in government matters. So what are the responsibilities of this office, the office of the prefect? Well, number one, he's the military commander of the troops that are in his territory. And historians think that there were probably about 3,000 troops stationed in Judea, but they were basically garrisoned at different fortresses throughout Judea. It wasn't like the prefect had like a standing army that he could order around. They were troops that were basically situated guarding cities and kind of keeping the peace, okay? And the troops themselves were not Roman legionaries, not the elite top tier of Roman troops, but rather they were what are called auxiliary troops. They were troops that were recruited from the provinces of the Roman Empire. So they would not necessarily be Roman citizens, but they would be members of some other race, possibly even some of them could be Jews themselves. Yeah, Fred.
Somebody, Tim was trying to get in.
Oh, thank you. And
You got it.
I think I got him. Okay. And hey, Tim, if you could remember to mute yourself, we just want to make sure there's no background noise. So commanding those troops was one responsibility of the prefect. Collection of taxes, okay, that's the most important thing to the Romans, right? To get their money out of these provinces, and that was the whole idea behind the census. He's going to perform limited judicial functions, and that's where Pontius Pilate is going to come in the trial of Jesus, okay? But most administrative functions were the responsibility of the locals. And in Judea, the local governing body is called the Sanhedrin, okay? And the head of the Sanhedrin is the high priest. So the prefect does appoint the high priest, right? But the Sanhedrin, we're going to talk about in a minute, they're going to be more of a representative body drawn from the populace themselves. So the Sanhedrin is mainly a court, right? Hearing cases, and that's where Jesus is initially brought for trial, okay? But they're also a legislative or governing body, right? They're responsible for collecting taxes on behalf of the prefect, more taxes that they're going to use for their own purposes, and interpreting the Jewish law, okay? So who makes up the Sanhedrin, right? Well, former high priests can be members of the Sanhedrin. Representatives of any of the 24 priestly castes in Jewish society, the scribes, the doctors of the law, and representatives of the most prominent families, with that being defined as anybody whose family was notable enough that they could marry a priest, or the daughter could marry a priest. So that's who makes up the Sanhedrin.
I've been scammed. I know my glucose numbers without.
Somebody, we got background noise coming from,
And I lowered my
I think it's you, Tim.
Mike, you can do
You can
it.
use them all.
Let's see if it's.
Here.
There you go.
There you go.
Okay, got it. Okay. So the Sanhedrin convened in a part of the temple called the Hall of Hewn Stones. And this is a representation of what people think it might have looked like. It kind of was stuck on the side of the temple. And there was a prohibition that no part of the temple could be made out of stones that were hewn with iron implements. So we can imagine that the stones were probably pretty rough looking, right? That made up the temple, okay? If you couldn't use iron implements. I'm not sure how you would dress stones without iron implements, but they figured out a way to do it. But anyway, to make this Hall of Hewn Stones a little nicer, okay, for the Sanhedrin, they couldn't make it literally part of the temple on the inside, the sacred part, so they kind of stuck it to the outside, right? So it was made of stones that were hewn with iron implements, but technically not part of the temple, you know, literally like a polyp on the side of the temple. So the Great Sanhedrin had 71 members. This was the nationwide Sanhedrin, if you will, right? But most of the matters were settled by what is called the Lesser Sanhedrin, a smaller core of people who met to deal with the day-to-day. The 71 would get together to deal with the big issues. And then each town in the realm had its own lesser Sanhedrin, like a local town council for dealing with local political issues. The other political group that the prefect would rely on to run his little prefecture are the Publicani. Okay, this is a group in Roman government that's not unique to Judea. This is something that happens everywhere in the Roman Empire. So these are basically private government contractors. Okay, they would supply the Roman state with military wares like uniforms and weapons and so forth, and they would supply the state with materials that it needed. They ran the mines that the Roman Empire owned, right? So they were extracting the mineral wealth that fed so much of the power of the Roman Empire. And they collected taxes. So these Publicani are the tax collectors who are so reviled in the Gospels, okay? And the reason they're so reviled and they're notorious, not just in Judea, but indeed everywhere in the Roman Empire, is that they basically made their living, made their profit by collecting as much as they could, which was over and above what the Roman government said you had to pay, okay? So these guys were basically strong arms who would extract as much as they thought they could get out of you, even though it was more than your tax bill said that you owed. Now, it's really unclear whether the Publicani could actually employ Roman soldiers in forcing people to pay. We don't really have any direct evidence of that. It's possible that they kind of used their own thugs for tax collection, but had kind of the implicit backing of the Roman government. And the extent to which these guys abused their power and how much they went beyond the assessed tax amount and collected over and above that really probably was controlled by the local governor, okay? The local governor or the prefect would, tell the Publicani, you can get an extra 5%, but anything beyond that, that's shearing a sheep rather than fleecing him. So we don't know how much Pontius Pilate was complicit in what his tax collectors were doing, but Pontius Pilate becomes the prefect of this little appendage of the province of Syria in the year 26 AD. And he's going to be prefect for the better part of 11 years, okay? Now, Pontius Pilate is known to us, of course, from all four Gospels, but other secular sources as well. His historicity is well attested. We're confident there really was a person named Pontius Pilate who ruled the prefecture of Judea in this time frame, right? In addition to the four Gospels, okay, multiple secular sources, and we have archaeological evidence. In 1996, in our lifetimes, they discovered what is called the Pilate Stone. And it was basically, I've got a picture of it here. This was an inscription that Pilate had made when he had built some temple or something that he dedicated to the divine Augustus Tiberius, who was emperor at that time. And it says, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this, whatever it was associated with. So what kind of guy was Pontius Pilate? Okay? And I think this is interesting because, you know, I always read the Gospels as kind of sympathetic to Pontius Pilate, that he didn't think that Jesus really should be executed, but he finally kind of gave in to the Jews. And what we're going to find out is that Pontius Pilate really was kind of a bad dude and a corrupt, hated ruler, right? So the first thing that he does that ticks off the Jews is he has his soldiers sneak some ensigns with human depictions into the city at night under the cover of darkness. So you know he's up to no good when he does it under a cover of darkness. He knows he's going to make the Jews mad because they're very touchy about anything that approximates a graven image, okay? So even though they're human images on these ensigns, right, the Jews are afraid they might be depicting, you know, pagan gods or something. So when the Jews ask him to remove these things, right, Pilate orders his soldiers to surround the demonstrators and threaten them with violence or death, okay? And the Jews actually kind of stand up to him, forcing Pontius Pilate to back down and do what they've asked. But he's gotten off on the wrong foot. Later on, he tries something similar. He puts up some gold shields in Herod's palace and refuses the request of the Jews to remove them, right? They hated Herod and they don't want his palace decorated in any way. So they write to Tiberius, the emperor, and Tiberius says, you know, why are you irritating your subjects needlessly, right? And he orders Pilate to have them removed. He uses money that's been donated to the temple for religious things. He takes that money and uses it to build an aqueduct, okay, for carrying water into Jerusalem. The Jews protest against him again, and this time Pontius Pilate doesn't mess around. He actually sends his troops into the crowd armed with daggers, and they kill some of the protesters. So a contemporary of Pontius Pilate, recounting, you know, kind of summarizing all the deeds that Pontius Pilate has committed, this Jewish philosopher named Philo basically lists all the things he doesn't like about Pontius Pilate. He says he's corrupt, insolent, rapacious, cruel, murderous, and inhumane, okay?
Otherwise, a nice guy.
Other than that, he's a good guy. All right, so Pontius Pilate is the Roman prefect at the time of the trial of Jesus around the year 30 AD. Now, of course, we don't know the precise date. We don't even know what year Jesus was tried in, but it was around the year 30 AD. So, as the Gospels tell us, Jesus enters Jerusalem with a purpose in mind. He's going there for the Passover celebration, right? This is an important festival every year for the Jews, very common for Jews from all over the place to come to Jerusalem to celebrate this holiday. So Jesus is taking advantage of that. So because this Passover holiday is going on, Pilate goes to Jerusalem. Now remember, last time we saw that Herod had built that great port city called Caesarea Maritima, okay? And that's actually where Pilate made his headquarters. He was not in Jerusalem most of the time, but it's because of the Passover celebration that Pilate comes to Jerusalem. So he's there at the same time as Jesus by coincidence. Also in attendance at the Passover celebration is Herod Antipas, the king up in Galilee, right? So normally he would be up in his realm, but as a devout Jew, he's coming to Jerusalem for the same reason that Jesus is, for the same reason that Pilate is, because of the Passover celebration. So Pilate goes there because he wants to show respect to his subjects, and also he wants to help maintain order because there's going to be a lot of people coming into town. So Jesus ends up getting arrested by a group called the Temple Guard, who report to the Sanhedrin, right? And we saw that for the most part, internal affairs are mainly governed by the Jews themselves, by the Sanhedrin, okay? So they're the ones who ordered the arrest of Jesus. The Gospel of John indicates that there were Roman soldiers there as well, and that's entirely possible, okay? But the main group that's actually taking custody of Jesus is this arm of the Sanhedrin called the Temple Guard. So the first place that he's tried is in front of the Sanhedrin, which is exactly how we understand the legal structure to operate, right? The Sanhedrin is the primary authority for internal affairs, but they do not have the power of capital punishment. So they hand him over to Pontius Pilate, saying, this guy is guilty of treason against Rome. You need to execute him, okay? According to the Gospels, Pilate balks at this, right? He doesn't think that what Jesus has done merits execution. So he decides to kind of wash his hands of it, and hands Jesus over to King Herod, who conveniently is also there in Jerusalem because of the Passover celebration. And his logic being, hey, this guy, Jesus, is from Galilee. You're the king of Galilee. This is really a matter for you to deal with, Herod. And for whatever reason, Herod says, no, I don't want to deal with it, kicks it back to Pilate, and ultimately Pilate is responsible for ordering Jesus's execution. So what happens with Pilate after Jesus's execution? Well, in 36 AD, he's called on the carpet again by the emperor. This time, he's being charged with being cruel to the Samaritans, right? Another group that's under his authority. So he's brought back to Rome and he is deposed. He's taken out of power by the Roman emperor. And there are some interesting traditions about what happens to Pilate after this. An early tradition holds that Pilate back in Rome quickly fell afoul of Tiberius's successor. Tiberius was the emperor at the time of Jesus's death. He's the one who called Pilate back onto the carpet, but Tiberius's successor is Caligula. And according to the legends, right, Pilate did something to irritate Caligula and was forced to commit suicide in the year 39 AD, right? And as we're going to see, pretty much it was pretty easy to irritate Caligula. There is a early Christian work called the Acts of Pilate, right? This was an early piece of Christian literature, and it contains a lot of different legends and myths about Pilate, Jesus's trial, and the crucifixion. So he's a source of fascination in the early church, okay? And his prominent role in the Gospels kind of corroborates that. Interestingly, Pilate himself is considered a saint even today in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Now, again, if you read the Gospels, he's not an unsympathetic character, right? He really seems like he's just bending to the will of the Jews, and it's really the Sanhedrin who are the bad guys, and that Pilate is like, okay, if it'll make you happy, I'll do this, but I don't think this guy has done anything wrong. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has taken that to the logical extreme, and they consider him a saint. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox Church, right, they consider his wife a saint, right? Remember, his wife, according to the Gospels, was the one who had the dreams that you're going to kill this guy who's going to be, so important to the world, right? So they consider her a saint for that reason. There's a place in Switzerland that is named for Pilate, Mount Pilate, okay? And supposedly, according to local tradition, Pilate himself is buried nearby underneath the lake Lucerne, okay? And the local legend says that every Easter or every Good Friday, the ghost of Pontius Pilate comes up out of this lake and washes his hands in the lake to kind of expiate his guilt. So interesting legends about the fate of Pontius Pilate. So before I go on to the next section, any questions about what we've covered so far? We have covered a lot of ground.
Why didn't the Jews just kill themselves?
Well, again, because they could not mete out capital punishment.
When we have all the examples of them stoning people.
We're gonna see what, like they killed James, the brother of Jesus, right? But as we're gonna see, that happens in an interregnum, okay? So, and we're getting a little bit of, we might get to it tonight, but basically, there's a period between Roman procurators where the Roman authorities aren't there, and the Jews take advantage of that to, kind of.
But they were going to stone the woman adulteress as well.
Well, and I think that if you read the gospel, that was kind of a popular, mob rule kind of thing. That wasn't the Sanhedrin, passing sentence on that person. That was like a bunch of really mad Jewish guys saying, we're going to take justice into our own hands here. Same with when Stephen was killed, again, kind of a mob rule kind of thing.
And Paul's orders were from.
So Paul was a Pharisee, right? Not necessarily part of the Sanhedrin or anything like that.
Right.
But, basically the Pharisees were kind of self-appointed do-gooders,
It was a vigilante.
Vigilant,
I like that. So, yes.
Okay.
Mike, this is Clark. I do have a question and I hope it's appropriate here.
Yeah.
Your reference to Pilate and his decision to have Jesus crucified. Is there any documentation, I believe in the Gospels, that refers to Barabbas, and they said, here, do you want him? I can release a prisoner. Who do you want released? And maybe I don't know if this is the right place. I'm just curious if there's documentation to that supports not a bad guy.
You're asking if beyond the Gospels, if we know about Barabbas from other sources?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I kind of vaguely remember that the answer is yes, but I don't want to say yes for
That's right.
sure.
Just curious more than anything. That's all right.
Pastor?
Yeah, it would be legend. on that. One of the problems when you're dealing with the Gospels and they're not necessarily chronologically want to be correct. As Sam was talking about, they're telling a story from a particular perspective. And one of the reasons, and one of the reasons why the Romans, and particularly in Mark, some of what Jesus is with his death is to fulfill prophecy. Okay, and one of the things about for example, Mark is it's not the Jews that kill him, it's the Romans that kill, because one of the things about Mark's gospel is that it's written shortly after they destroy the temple. And you'll talk about that later on. And so there's the question I read one say is that Mark and all the Jews and the people who were following Mark were ticked off at the Romans at the time. And so they made them the scapegoats of that. What happens is that and that's Mark is the basic story of Jesus. Matthew and Luke expound upon that story. And the thing that Matthew and Mark do is Matthew and Luke do is they give it religious meaning, larger perspective on this, about the basic story of why Jesus dies and why is it that Pilate does this. And so one of the things about Matthew and Luke is that, yes, Pilate does the thing, but if you look at Matthew and Luke, Pilate is the sympathetic guy. Okay, the people who are really the bad guys in that are the Sanhedrin and whatever. Okay, and some scholars will say, well, that's purposeful, because one of the things that Jesus is doing is bringing a new religious system. He's confronting the old religious system against religious. So who are you going to make the bad guys? Not necessarily the Romans, but you're going to make the religious leaders. So there's all that crazy, stuff. But in a sense, one of the things is that there is that I think there was some legends about Barabbas. Okay, Barabbas may have very well have been a particular person. Jesus was not the only Messiah or whatever who died during this time. There were several others who were living at the time who were also were attacked and killed. It's just Jesus' story gets told about. And I think there was a story about Barabbas being arrested. And so they used his story and put it in there. I can't remember. God, I wish I knew do that, because I read that once.
Well, I will research that.
That's a good point to.
I didn't mean to get you off track. I just was curious.
Not a problem.
Yeah, I read too, where after the destruction of the temple, then, the whole Jewish infrastructure crumbled.
Yeah.
And there was competition between who are we going to follow now? And so, Luke and Matthew did the Jesus part. And so they wrote it to show that he was really a descendant of David, and on and on and on and on. And how
Justified
with Old Testament scripture. But the competitor was John the Baptist. There was a big following of John the Baptist. So the Jesus people got transferred to the Gentiles, mostly to John, I think. It's all afterwards.
To be covered.
Yeah, okay. We're getting ahead of ourselves.
Any other questions before we? Hopefully, we'll get everything finished tonight. But so the next guy that's going to be the main governor of this area is another Herod. Okay, Herod Agrippa. Okay, and Herod Agrippa is also mentioned in the New Testament. He's the guy that kills the James, the son of Zebedee, but not the same Herod as Herod the Great or Herod Antipas. Okay, so the thing about Herod Agrippa is that he's the grandson of Herod the Great and Mariamne through another one of Herod's sons, okay, who didn't end up ruling as part of the tetrarchy, but he kind of stumbles into power in Judea through his relationship with some powerful Romans, okay? So he's actually named for Augustus's best friend and general, Marcus Agrippa. Okay, his father was in Rome, just like most of Herod's sons were, and had befriended Agrippa and named his own child Herod Agrippa after him. Okay, so Herod Agrippa is educated in Rome, and there, he's kind of moving in the circles of the highest levels of society. Okay, and he becomes friends with the future emperors Caligula and Claudius, and this is going to be important for his faith, because his father is on the out when the kingdom is divided up. So Herod Agrippa really doesn't have any expectation that he's going to rule down there. And in fact, in 37 AD, he does something, we don't know what, that causes him to be imprisoned by the Emperor Tiberius on suspicion of conspiracy. So he's thrown in jail, and it looks like he's going to die there. But that same year, the Emperor Tiberius dies, and he is succeeded by his nephew Caligula, okay? And as we saw, Herod Agrippa was friends with Caligula. So lucky stroke for him, right? One of your best friends becomes emperor. And one of the first things Caligula does is he frees Agrippa, and he gives him a gold chain equal in weight to the prison manacles that had kept him affixed to his cell, okay? And then Caligula goes one step further, and he gives him Philip's old part of the tetrarchy that has been vacant for a couple of years. So he promotes Agrippa, who really had no expectations of ruling anything. He puts him in power down in Judea, okay? So then Agrippa whispers in Caligula's ear that his uncle, Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, has been plotting against Rome, right? And Caligula, as we're going to see, is a pretty paranoid guy. So he believes Agrippa, and he deposes Herod Antipas, the guy who was king when at the time of Jesus's trial, okay? So now he gives that part of the tetrarchy to Herod Agrippa. So now Herod Agrippa has half of the tetrarchy. He has Philip's piece, and he has Herod Antipas's piece. But Herod Agrippa is going to have his hands full managing his boss, Caligula, because Caligula is increasingly going to demonstrate that he's probably insane, but he's definitely a tyrannical megalomaniac, right? So among the things that he does that give us evidence of this, he makes his horse a priest, and he actually intends on making his horse consul, which is basically the highest position in the Roman government. It's like president of the United States, okay? He turns his own sisters into prostitutes. He murders most of his male relatives, just like Herod the Great had done. Caligula did the same thing, with one notable exception we're going to meet in a minute. Hey, Caligula also believed himself to be a god. So what he had done in Rome was he had his stonemasons go around and cut the heads off of different statues for different gods and put Caligula's head on top of these statues, okay? So Caligula, believing himself to be a god, orders a giant statue of himself placed inside the temple so the Jews could worship him, right? Can you think of anything that's going to be more offensive to the Jews and trip a rebellion than what Caligula is trying to do? And of course, the Jews do revolt, okay? So what happens is the governor of Syria has to invade Judea in order to suppress this rebellion, right? And again, this kind of shows the relationship between the prefecture and the province of Syria, right? It's when there's real problems, okay? The one that's got a real army at his command is not the prefect, it's the actual governor. So the governor of Syria brings in an army, and the Jews don't try to fight him. They peacefully stand up to this Roman army, and it so impresses the Syrian governor that he basically talks to Agrippa and says, we need to deal with Caligula, because I don't want to just slaughter all these people for what's going on here. So Agrippa goes back to Rome and manages to convince Caligula to rescind his order. And we'd love to know what he said to Caligula. So remember I said that Caligula killed most of his male relatives. Well, the one exception was his uncle Claudius. And Claudius, by his own admission, had a number of physical defects. He stammers, he limps, right? And so basically, Caligula keeps him around to be the butt of his jokes, right? He likes to have Claudius there at the dinners so he can make fun of him. And Claudius manages to survive the bloody reign of Caligula because of this. So in 41 AD, after only a few years of being emperor, Caligula is finally assassinated. Somebody gets up the courage to get rid of this nutcase, okay? And the Praetorian Guard, basically the personal troops around the emperor, are trying to figure out who do we put in his place. They name Claudius as Caligula's successor, okay? And this is new in the history of the Roman Empire. The imperial bodyguard has now made themselves basically the imperial kingmakers, okay? And this is going to be a dark development for the Roman Empire, because they're going to exercise this authority repeatedly in coming years, okay? But this is the first time it happens. Now, Claudius, being a good Roman, says, you know, this isn't right. The Praetorian Guard shouldn't raise me to the power. The Senate also resists this. But on the scene there is Herod Agrippa, and he's the one who convinces Claudius to basically man up and become emperor. And Claudius does so, convinces the Senate to accept him with Agrippa's support, and Claudius then becomes the new emperor, and he rewards Agrippa by giving him the rest of Palestine. So now we have the kingdom unified again under Herod Agrippa as a result of his relations with the Roman overlords. So we will finish the reign of Herod Agrippa next week, and we'll wrap up with the Jewish revolt, but it is 7 o'clock, so wanted to be respectful of your time. But if you have any questions about what I covered tonight, I'll be happy to try and answer them now, or take them back for research, as we're going to do with the question about Barabbas. Okay, well, thank you very much for turning out on this snowy day.
Thank you.
I hope to see you 1 week from tonight. We'll finish up our class.
As always, fascinating, Mike. Thanks so much, buddy.
Okay, take care.
Oh,